Hello, 7th and 8th grade. We're continuing today with Chapter 22, Troubled Times for America. I do want to remind you that this section of the history book tends to get a little on the depressing side, so I wanted to encourage you to do something a little different with your free time as you're adding in extra stuff to learn about this era. We're talking about the 60s and 70s. So I would like to encourage you to watch some TV shows from the 60s and 70s, things that can be fun, that you can see the pop culture of American history, because it really wasn't as depressing as the history book makes it sound, because it's just hitting the important points that were heavily covered by the news media. And sometimes the news media can focus only on things that are very, very negative. So just a couple of examples of shows that you could watch that are specifically from the 60s and 70s. You can watch some more Twilight Zone if you enjoyed that Twilight Zone episode about the mannequins. That's kind of creepy. There's lots more Twilight Zone all the way through the 70s. Really great show. One of my personal favorites, Green Acres. So funny, so much fun. I watched it every day when I came home from school when I was in elementary. It was really great. There's a little pig on it named Arnold. He's adorable. Okay. Then there's Hogan's Heroes, which was about a group of men who were in a POW camp during World War II, and they helped actually people escape from the German the German POW camps. Stalags, that's what they were. The Andy Griffith Show, Mayberry RFD, and Gomer Pyle USMC, all really fun stories from the American South during this time, and not at all as frustrating or as sad as what we saw with Jackie Robinson. I just watched that movie again yesterday just to finish filling out the film guide. And I love that story. It's such an important story, but I did get frustrated with the way some people treated him. I got very frustrated, honestly. But there's a lot of great movies out there and stories from the 60s and 70s. So give them a shot. Even if you want to watch some kind of a fun take on the space race, I Dream of Jeannie, weirdly enough, deals with that. So give it a shot. My Favorite Martian, also a really great one. Ask your parents and your grandparents what they used to watch when they were growing up. Your parents are too young for the 60s and 70s, but your grandparents are not. So ask around, ask what people's favorites. People would remember for things like reruns, what their favorite reruns are. And if you need to, just go onto your streaming service and search out 60s TV shows, 70s TV shows, and you'll find a good collection. So I want you to do that too, so that you realize that just because this was a rough time for American history, it doesn't mean that everybody was always down in the dumps, staring at their navels, dragging their feet on the ground. Okay, there were some funny parts too. There were some enjoyable parts of American life. Okay, so now that we've said that, let's talk about the stuff that wasn't so enjoyable. Let's start with, we talked about last time in 1964, the North Vietnamese Navy allegedly attacked American ships. And we used the phrase allegedly, meaning we don't know absolutely for sure. There are two different groups of people who were both on the same American boats who said, either it didn't happen or yes, it did happen, but they would not ever just completely and totally agree. And when the president was asked, did the United States fire on North Vietnamese military first, his response was, for all I know, our Navy was shooting at whales out there, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because the military is not going to be shooting whales. People do whale hunt, but they whale hunt for a specific purpose, for meat and oil. Okay? And the U.S. Navy is not going to use either of that. But this was his quote in 1965. On August 2nd, 1964, two American destroyers engaged three North Vietnamese torpedo boats, sinking one of them. On August 4th, 1964, the American destroyers reported a second engagement with North Vietnamese boats. However, the second report was later discovered to be false. Together, these two incidents prompted the first large-scale involvement of the U.S. Armed Forces in Vietnam. Now, he was not able to convince the Congress to declare war, which means the monies were not released for war. So he had to basically piecemeal together funds for the U.S. military to get weapons, uniforms, and food to the soldiers in Vietnam. The Vietnam War is technically not even a war. It's considered a police action, but the men who fought in it, it was a war, period. So the Vietnam War was an attempt of some 500,000 American soldiers to defend freedom in a no-win conflict. It was not a no-win conflict because the other side was better equipped or better trained than the U.S. soldiers. It was because the United States was not allowed to win. So our soldiers were not allowed to win this conflict. LBJ and his group of guys were pushing for the idea of keeping communism contained, pushing the communists up above that parallel back into North Vietnam. Now, we saw this exact same thing play out in Korea, and it ended up with a draw, where basically everything went back to before where it was before the war. It didn't work that time. It's not going to work this time. You cannot contain your enemy. It has to be destroyed, unfortunately. So when it comes to things like communism specifically, communism cannot be contained. It will always push. Okay, so here are some of the big news things having to do with Vietnam. You'll notice that there are 5 presidents at the very top of this page. All 5 of these presidents had a hand in Vietnam. They were part of the Vietnam conflict. At the bottom, at the top, right under the banner where the presidents are, the top picture here. I can't do it. It's got to go that way. Anyway, he is shaking hands with who was the man who was the president of South Vietnam, but unfortunately, even though his people brought him in and they hired him, he was not really a good leader. Below you have JFK, who is showing the map and his plans for, again, containment, but he really just wanted to send advisors in to help. LBJ was really hoping to finish the war on a high note, get his men to fight, to finish the war quickly, get a win, and then get out. Nixon is the one, though, who announced the ceasefire, and he got our people out almost as fast as he could. However, before he did that, he sent troops into neighboring countries to find the sources for other communist influences that were helping to support the communists in Vietnam. And later on, he was accused of going back on his word because he went into other countries and were trying to find the source material. His whole intention there was to try to cut off supply lines for the communists, but people just didn't get that part. And then the last people who came out of Vietnam, American soldiers that came out during the presidency of Ford. So it's a very long battle. The biggest and most shocking series of battles was the Tet Offensive. Tet was a major holiday. It was a New Year holiday. And the North Vietnamese chose that holiday specifically because they didn't think that anybody in the South would be ready. They would be so busy partying that they wouldn't be ready for this. So they invaded on that day, and they invaded the American embassy, and they invaded several people throughout several neighborhoods in South Vietnam. Now, some of them were dressed like soldiers, but most of them were not. This is actually, I believe, South Vietnam that you're seeing in that picture. Most of them were dressed in just regular street clothes. The man who is on the bottom left of your screen, he's wearing a pair of shorts and a plaid top. And there's another man holding his hand up saying, no, pictures right here. This man was caught after having shot several police officers in South Vietnam. He assassinated them. It wasn't a war. He considered himself to be in a battle, but he was shooting the police officers specifically. And as a result, the police chief executed him there on the street for that action. Now, this is the picture that went out around the world, and it was unfortunately misinterpreted that here is a man who is supposed to be innocent. He's not been proven guilty in a court of law, and the police chief is, shooting him, and America's on the side of this police chief, and that's not right. The man who took the photograph was very close friends with the police chief. He was an American who was close friends with him. And he said, this is one of the nicest guys in the world, but he had just learned of the death of several of his officers, many of whom had families. And this is the guy who pulled the trigger and who assassinated him. So as far as he was concerned, this was part of an act of war here. Now this police chief, was praised by American officials. The man who took the photograph spoke out in his defense and said, no, this is a good guy. I know how this picture has been twisted by the media back in the United States, but let me tell you, this guy did not do anything cruel or inhuman, as far as I'm concerned. And this police chief ended up moving to the United States of America and owned a pizza parlor in Virginia. Things happen. Okay, Congress refused to allow the needed military action to actually finish the war on a high note, but American and South Vietnamese forces managed to hold communists back. But remember, their purpose was not to hold the communist line, it was to push the communists back over their line, but they're not going to be able to do it without the proper reinforcements. Some conservatives felt that communist sympathizers in high-ranking government positions were deliberately hindering the United States military ability to achieve victory in Vietnam because the North Vietnamese were communists. And they said, well, if we have communist sympathizers in high-ranking government, then it's very likely that they're the ones keeping us from winning. Okay, Daniel Chappie James became a general. He distinguished himself in Korea and flew 78 combat missions in Vietnam. He became our first Black American general. There he is, 4-star general. 1974 became the first Black man in U.S. history to achieve the rank of 4-star general. Pretty impressive. During the Vietnam years, patriotism hit an all-time low in America. You had liberal and rebellious young people who were on college campuses who were being trained by many college professors who were pro-communist or pro-socialist, and they were being told a very different story about American soldiers in Vietnam. And on college campuses across the United States, they demonstrated against the war. The young man in the top picture, he's putting flowers inside the gun barrels. On the bottom picture, you've got Vietnam veterans against the war. It was a horrendous war, and could have been done better, but that's talking years later. Now, some people burned United States flags to demonstrate their defiance and hatred toward America. Many college students and professors openly avowed communist belief or sympathy. So there was a big change going on from after World War II, when communism was seen as something that would destroy this country, to many young people and college professors openly avowing it and claiming it as their personal belief. And some of those are still avowing that today. Communism has had an upsurge. It's had an upswing. Communism and socialism are a big part of American culture today. You've got people who want it today. They want to see the United States go more socialist. College campuses were plagued with riots, war protests, flag burning, and other anti-American activities. This is what I tell all my students. Look at the actions of the people involved. If they are behaving violently, they are violent. Learn from that. If they are claiming that everybody else is being hateful and yet they are creating hateful situations, then they're the ones that are being hateful. So if there is anti-American activities that are violent, those are the people you don't want to be on that side. Some young men dodged the draft. The draft is when you're forced or you're compelled to join the military. Some refused to fight and moved to other countries, Canada specifically. This is a young man burning his draft card, saying that he will not serve in the draft. And the United States does still have a draft. It hasn't been used since Vietnam. Every young man, when he turns 18, is supposed to register with the local post office to say that he is available for fighting in the military in case of emergency. Hippies. These are young people who turned to drugs and an immoral lifestyle. Basically, what hippies did was they said, okay, how did the previous generation live, and how can I live exactly the opposite of that? What is considered good in society? I want to do the exact opposite of that, because they looked at society as being inherently flawed and they didn't want anything to do with the way society was for them. So they wanted to do the exact opposite. So they went without bathing. Yay. They wore dirty, ragged, unconventional clothing. They deliberately broke all codes of politeness or manners. Pooping on the street became a thing, and that has come back. Doing drugs, having sex, not just outside of marriage, but having sex with strangers became a thing. Public nudity became an issue. Everything was about making others feel uncomfortable, because they figured if they made other people feel uncomfortable, then they were breaking them away from the society that they were protesting. Rock music played an important part of the hippie movement, and it had a great influence over the hippies. However, not all rock music is definitely bad. You have to listen to the words, and you have to look at the lifestyle of the people who are singing. So many rock musicians that the hippies followed belonged to Eastern religious cults, but many of them didn't. Many of them were just not really religious at all, and it really didn't have an impact on their music. But here are 3 rock musicians who are famous for all having died at age 27. They called it the 27 Club, and all of them died as a result of drug and alcohol abuse, which is just sad. They're very talented people, but died way too young. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., JFK's brother. After JFK was killed in Dallas, his brother, after LBJ went, he ran once and won, but he had the opportunity to run a second time, and he said, no, I'm not going to run. The reason LBJ decided not to run was because he was really frustrated with how badly the Vietnam War was going, and as far as he was concerned, he could only do that. As a president, he could only be president. He couldn't be president and run a campaign at the same time. So he wanted to finish his presidency by being the best president he could be, despite the horrible situation he was in with the Vietnam War. So he didn't even run for a second term. But John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, who had been the attorney general for his brother, he emerged as the strongest Democratic contender for the 1968 presidency. Now, the people, they kind of liked the Kennedy family for the romance of the Kennedy family. They saw these men as being very handsome. They were wealthy. They were old. They weren't really old money, but they came across like they were old money. And they had these movie star good looks. They were very intelligent. And Robert Kennedy was basically following in his older brother's footsteps. Now, he and his family took a train trip around the United States to stump for president. His wife was pregnant again. They had, I think it was 10 kids, and she was pregnant with their last kid. And so they really pushed for the idea of, here we are, we're a happy family, we're a good family. They were trying to repair some of his reputation because JFK had a reputation of being a womanizer. Robert Kennedy had that same kind of reputation. Their younger brother, Teddy Kennedy, definitely had a reputation for being a womanizer. And in fact, he was investigated for the death of a woman that he crashed the car in. He and a woman were in a car. They crashed the car into a river, and he left the car. He swam to shore, and the next morning called the police to let them know that there was still a body in that car. He left her there to die. So they had to do some repair work on the family's reputation. And for Robert Kennedy, that was having his wife, who was very great with child, travel with him across the United States. While he was campaigning in California, he was at a hotel and he was assassinated by a man named Sirhan Bashara Sirhan, who was protesting Kennedy's work with Israel. The man that you see standing or squatting next to Kennedy was right there when it happened. He had just shook hands with President Kennedy and was talking to him when this happened. And he was actually a busboy at the hotel. Sirhan was running through the kitchen when he was literally tackled by a football player who was there for Robert Kennedy's speech. That man's name was Rosey Grier. He was famous as a football player and as a television personality, and he tackled Sirhan. So that's how the police captured him. So Sirhan, born March 19th, 1944, is a Palestinian Arab with Jordanian citizenship. Born in Jerusalem, held strong anti-Zionist beliefs. He did not believe that Israel should be a country. And he is stated as saying, my determination to eliminate RFK is becoming more and more of an unshakable obsession. RFK must die. RFK must be killed. Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated before 5 June 1968. That was the first anniversary of the start of the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbors. When Sirhan was booked by police, they found in his pocket a newspaper article that discussed Kennedy's support for Israel. And at his trial, Sirhan testified that he began to hate Kennedy after learning of this support. My only connection with Robert Kennedy was his sole support of Israel and his deliberate attempt to send those 50 bombers to Israel to obviously do harm to the Palestinians. That would be during the Six-Day War. Look at the people who are creating the violence. Okay, the vice president who was chosen to run for, he was vice president under LBJ. He began to run instead because now that RFK was dead, they needed a new person for the Democratic Party to run. And so they chose the vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And he ran against Richard Nixon, who was a Republican, and an Alabama governor named George C. Wallace, who ran on a third-party ticket as an independent. The majority of people in the United States did not want George Wallace to be president. He was very much a racist and ran basically on changing the civil rights situation. We had worked so hard to get equal rights and civil rights for everybody, and he wanted to go back to the way things were before. Which is kind of sad, stupid. Richard M. Nixon won the 1960 presidential election. He had run against JFK and was saying the right things. People who heard their debates on the radio believed that Nixon won. But when people who watched it, they thought that John F. Kennedy won because John F. Kennedy was a better looking man and JFK looked way better than Nixon. So really the first time that Nixon lost to JFK, a lot of it had to do with appearance, not so much message. But now he is running, he's got a split vote on his side, and he wins the 1960 presidential election, and he won it very handily, again with that split vote. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, is going to end up getting in trouble, though. I think we're going to talk about that. No, we're not. Okay, he's going to end up getting in trouble. He is going to be discovered to have been cheating on his taxes, and so he's going to be asked to resign. And for the next presidential election, Nixon's going to have to get another person to be his vice president. So during Nixon's presidency, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. And his first words were, "That is one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind." So here we have Neil Armstrong, Alan Shepard, and then we have to give this man's name out because he tends to get forgotten. His name is Michael Collins. He's in the middle there. I want to remember Michael Collins because the other two guys got to get out and walk on the moon. Michael Collins was the guy who had to stay in the ship and keep everything running. So he made it all the way to the moon and couldn't get out. So I feel bad for him. So I make sure I mention him every time. Okay, so you have the opportunity now to go on YouTube and look at the first space landing. Watch it. There's like a little model where they're showing how things are going to work and then an actual space landing. But go on there and just research it. Look for a space landing, the first one, 1969. Yes, it really did happen. So go and look for that on YouTube. It's a lot of fun. During the time of Nixon, we've got the space landing happening, but then we had pantheism becoming a thing again. You think that pantheism would be long gone by this time. It's a pagan form of worship. It is the worship of nature. And people started saying things like, nature is my religion, the earth is my temple. People started calling themselves environmentalists for the first time. And environmentalism is really pantheism. It's New Age environmentalism. It's a kind of pantheism. And they started the very first holiday. They have a major holiday. It is a religious holiday. It is called Earth Day, established in 1970. So the first Earth Day, when it was celebrated in 1970, they swore up, down, and sideways that the Earth was going to end in 20 years. And so you might as well just get ready to wear gas masks all the time anyway, because everything was going to die. That is not true. Every single year that they've given for the Earth is going to be either covered in water because the ice caps have melted, or it's going to be completely frozen over because we're going to be in a new ice age, or we're going to have horrible coastlines because our coastlines are just going to melt off into the sea. All of that has been proven wrong. All of it. Even when they say our storms today are worse than they've ever been, that's absolutely not true. You can go back. The history is there. We've had really bad storms for decades and decades and decades before now. Okay, conservation. This was something that was basically taken by the environmentalists and made their own, even though people had been practicing conservation for a very, very long time. And long before the pantheists or environmentalists got involved, but they made it sound like nobody has ever conserved anything until they were there. But remember, when we talked about World War I and World War II, and people were recycling, and people were doing paper drives and scrap metal drives, people were doing rubber drives where they would collect tires and things to create new tires out of that. People had been conserving things for a very, very, very long time. And even in the 60s, people, when they drank a soda, they drank it out of a glass bottle, and then they took that soda bottle back to the grocery store, and the grocery store would pay them 5 cents or a penny or whatever the cost was. They would pay them get the bottles back. Those bottles would go back to the factories, and they would be cleaned and refilled. So for a long time, people have been practicing conservation, but as time went on, people became more and more intrigued with disposable items, and conservation became less of a practice. But now you have the pantheists who are saying, no, conservation, this is what we need to do, even though it wasn't something that they had been doing before this. People around the United States have been doing this long before the pantheists had gotten involved. Political environmentalism views man as the enemy of nature. They look at man as a parasite to the world. Its goal is to pass laws that hurt private property owners and hinder the advance of technology in an effort to protect nature against the cost of mankind. Most political environmentalists tend to be on the socialist side of the spectrum. They don't really believe in capitalism. They believe in socialism and communism rather than capitalism. So here's a really good example of this. We've got a woman saying she's in a battery-powered, eco-groovy electric car, but when you trace back electric cars and where do they get their electricity? Well, from burning coal. Actually, natural gas is a really, really convenient and clean way to make electricity. Okay, so we've talked about pantheism and we've talked about environmentalism. So now that we've talked about that, you need to watch Star Wars: A New Hope because it is all about this movement. I know you're thinking, what? The space movie? Yes. When you watch it, you're going to see a lot of environmentalism, pantheism, Buddhism thrown in there, along with some characters from World War II called stormtroopers. Those were Hitler's first guys on the street that were his original police force. So I want you to go and watch Star Wars: A New Hope. I'll be honest with you, it's not my favorite movie, but you can watch it for a class. There's a film guide in there. In your textbook, go ahead and fill it out, and I'll be getting that information from you when you're finished. But I thank you so much for paying attention today, and that will be it for today, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.